The second area of universal design for learning is representation. Representation is the what of learning. This refers to what the students are seeing, how they are perceiving it, and how they comprehend the information. The way content is represented has a massive impact on the ability of students to encode that learning into long-term memory. Now let's start with a quick exercise. What do you see? Do you see an older woman or a younger woman? What if I told you that there's both? I'll give you a moment to look. Well, how about now? Can you see it? If we add some shading, how about now? The way you represent your content is one of your strongest accessibility features as a teacher. You might not have been able to visually access one or more of the images until we used a different means of representation to show it to you. Utilizing diverse representation in a universal design for learning framework is focused on 3 different domains. Perception, which is how we perceive information that's conveyed to us. Language and symbols, how we gain access across linguistic variations, normally occurring within subject-specific vocabulary and symbols commonly found in mathematics. And finally, comprehension, which is the ability to recall previously learned information. Using diverse representation to improve perception is about having diverse modalities for instruction. While there has been a long-standing myth that students learn best in one format or another, commonly referred to as a learning style, the practice of teaching content in one sensory domain, such as primarily auditory or kinesthetic, has been widely discredited. Rather, we learn using all of our senses at the same time. It is true that some students do not have access to all of their senses equally, but generalizing that students are primarily tactile or visual learners tends to lead to stale instruction that does not allow students enough supplemental information in other sensory areas to fully encode knowledge into their long-term memory, nor the ability to recall and use that information when appropriate. While most instructors use some sort of visual or auditory information to supplement instruction, they frequently prioritize one over the other. Think to yourself, am I the kind of teacher that's going to use a lot of videos? Or am I the teacher that's going to use PowerPoints and lecture to students while they write notes? While neither of these are harmful practices to student learning, when instruction only uses one of these formats, students become disinterested, which hurts engagement as we talked about before, but it also dampens their long-term access and understanding.
So again, I can talk about it from 2 different perspectives because I teach for my online courses. I do incorporate lecture. I do narrated PowerPoints. And so I have that aspect. But then I also, these are graduate students, so a lot of learning is on them in terms of reading, the textbook, the articles, watching the PowerPoints. I also include some webinars or podcasts that present the content in different ways.
My classes are more collaborative because I'm teaching about collaboration, and it's a subject that if you don't do it, you have to be able to do it. And so I think it totally depends on the content. There's some classes that I've taught that are very content heavy. This is how you do something. So I can teach through a lecture, this is how you do it. But then if we don't practice that, there isn't that translation from this is what you do to how you do. And I think that is really important, that you have to teach it in more of a collaborative application method for students to really understand it. But there are times where you have to lecture and you have to teach the content. But again, it goes to the front loading. What does my planning look like to really think about that content, to know what is the best way to get that knowledge across to the students, and then, act accordingly.
What I've been able to do more is, and it's not as much as others because I'm not a technologically based person, I'm more a relational based person, but being able to use video clips a lot more in class, being able to have students in certain activities use certain types of technology to look things up and to be able to communicate depending on the class that it is. But I am not the greatest one at being technologically advanced or necessarily technologically creative.
I try to there could be videos, so YouTube videos that's talking about it, somebody else's voice. There are articles to read. There's a textbook to read. There's me talking. So I think it comes across those different ways. And again, it kind of depends on the content of what's going to be the best match for it. But those would be the different ways that I incorporate media.
I try to break up the sound of my voice with video when possible. I like real people. So if a class is talking about a content area and there's a fit for a guest speaker, I like a guest speaker to come in because I can speak from secondhand, but I feel like if there's someone who could be sort of a primary source for something, I like that. And it breaks it up and is a nice, I guess viewing a person as multimedia is a little strange, but I view them as like a multimedia source. I like doing videos, though sometimes the audio is funky, so I try not to rely on them. I always go in thinking like the video's not going to work, so what are you going to do when the video doesn't work? And I enjoy case studies, so giving information about a scenario or a student and working through a problem-solving procedure or a lesson planning procedure or an assessment procedure and just thinking about like a real-life scenario but in a lower stress environment than like actually having to go do it. So role-playing I do sometimes if it makes sense for the content. Actual demonstration, especially for lesson planning, can be really useful. Like, here's how you lesson plan, here's what it looks like when you do it.
If, when you are teaching, you find yourself only using auditory information for instruction, such as lecture or verbal instruction for activities, go ahead and add some visual or tactile information to supplement your instruction. Further, if you see yourself relying heavily on visual information, make sure to add written descriptions for images and always have closed captioning turned on for these videos. Adding these small pieces of diverse sensory information will greatly improve your students' understandings. Found within every representation of information is the use of language and symbols. We represent information in a whole host of different ways. Information that you think might make information clear to students, say an image that supports your instruction or a mathematical symbol, or a specific technical term seen only in your content area, may be incredibly puzzling to students. Students that come speaking multiple languages other than English as their primary language might not understand exactly what you're talking about until you provide images and explanation to support your instruction. Recognize that all your students come to your class at different levels of understanding. Don't be frustrated because you think your students should understand something you've already taught or something that you thought should have already been clear, and they should already understand it the first time around. The human brain is diverse, and the role of teachers is to help students gain these understandings. There are several steps a teacher can take to support a student's understanding of symbols and language. These are just a few. Finally, let's talk about representation supporting comprehension. The purpose of education is not to teach students how to remember random facts, but rather to teach learners how to transform accessible information into usable knowledge. Decades of cognitive research have demonstrated that the capability to transform accessible information into usable knowledge is not a passive one, but an active one. Supporting comprehension through diverse representation is more closely tied to lesson structure. All lessons should include the two following things. First, activating or supplying background knowledge on content and generalizing that to other areas. And highlighting relationships and critical features in big ideas. Now let's unpack that. Activating previous knowledge is crucial for students to retain information. The brain is more likely to retain information that is an extension of other information or sits within a specific content area than it is to remember a novel concept alone. Consider starting your lesson with a review of previous information that will be crucial to understanding that lesson's content. This doesn't have to be a super extensive review. 5 to 10 minutes is plenty. But this gets students warmed up and it builds the foundation for them to connect information to. Further, make sure towards the end of your lesson to explore where they might be able to use the new content outside of your class. Now, they probably won't go out searching for these experiences, but it works similar to the review process because it creates situational cues to remember your information.
It means, well, if you don't do it, students aren't going to learn. So you have to tie your content to what do they already know. And so I think it's important when you're thinking, I can't just think about my class. My class fits in within a whole series of knowledge that students are learning in order to be teachers. And so I have to have a really good basis of a foundational knowledge of what else is being taught. So I can say, so remember when you heard, this is how it applies into this situation, and this is where it would look in the future. And so if I don't make those connections, I think sometimes students just learn, I learned this here and here and here, but how does it all connect together? And so if I don't activate that background knowledge, then it's just words being talked and there's nowhere to kind of file that knowledge away. I have to give it to them then, is I have to form that, either that content background knowledge that they need or the experience, and help them think about it in different ways. And so maybe they don't bring it in with them from another class, but generally I can tie it to somewhere in their life, what they've been through, their experiences as being a student. So I have to fill that in so they can make that connection to be able to use in the future.
Activating prior knowledge is tapping into the student's kind of understanding of the content or topic being presented, to make a meaningful connection to whatever it is you're going to be focusing on. And so that's important because it kind of primes them for learning. It helps them, it kind of sets the stage for learning and helps them make that connection instead of assuming they know it or just going right into it. It really primes them for that learning.
At the beginning of the class, I'll usually do some sort of activity or assignment or something to get a gist of what everyone knows already if I'm not sure, so that I'm, again, not repeating, but building on. But everyone doesn't start at the same place. So when I am providing content that might be redundant or sort of review, I'll try to just acknowledge it up front, be like, you might already know this. If you do, don't worry about it. If you don't worry about it. We're just going to go over this briefly to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Now, you may be thinking, this is so much work. How am I ever going to make sure that every single part of my instruction is being explained in multiple ways at the same time? Do not fret. We aren't saying that every piece of information needs to be in multiple formats, but rather that information that exists at pinch points needs to be in multiple formats. Pinch points are areas of your content that have been historically difficult to teach students on a macro level. Remember this thing? This is one of the most renowned pinch points in all of public education, the Pythagorean theorem. This is an equation that is used to find the third side in a right triangle when we already know two sides. This piece of information is the gateway for understanding pre-calculus, calculus, trigonometry, physics, engineering, and so many more advanced math concepts. And it's also a pinch point in math because it's difficult to understand conceptually. If you can identify areas in your class where students have struggled before, like per se the Pythagorean theorem, focus here with adding multiple means of representation. This will save you hours of reteaching later on. Add in these diverse modes of representation and keep track of how students perform. This will not only allow you to teach the most difficult concepts with ease, but makes adding universal design for learning tenets to your instruction much more manageable.